classic. Took the words right out of my mouth. All right. So this is a lecture on light. We were going for a while, but now we're back. We're just keeping things. Well, we're not keeping them, but we're gonna start basic. Essentially, I took about 2 weeks to throw together a little lecture, and what I want to do is essentially take the idea of light and then try to make it more beginner friendly. Because I feel like an issue that people have is they think about lighting and then they try to apply that lighting to specific things, and then they're like, yo, there's like so many things to balance. Like, there's so many elements to this. I just want to make like a pretty picture of what's going on here. So I sort of want to like flatten out some of that stuff. It might be like a bit technical in the beginning. Like, you might see some scary charts, you might see some wavy lines. But other than that, like, we're gonna try and like reform the stuff that we talk about into like just like a checklist for when we're making artwork. And that's sort of how I want to keep things. Quick notes here. One of them is on the notes itself. Like I said, this did take me a while, so if I have to like pause and like look at them, forgive me. Sorry. Uh, my brain only can fit so much info. So forgive me for that. There's a lot of sources that I grabbed as well. Those will be at the end as well. If you notice the channel for group study, that is locked and now invisible. That is because I wanted to save all that stuff till the end, just so that no one's peeking, no one's uh, getting ahead on the info. But yeah, that'll open up after that. And another little quick disclaimer is I think it's awesome to take notes. I think it's awesome to try and like learn as best you can, but try not to memorize the information. Like I said, there's gonna be a few technical things in this, but the goal is not to like memorize like every single like chart that I pull up and like definition for each word. A lot of this stuff myself, I sort of like made up or changed so that it fits illustration. Depending on what field you go into, depending on where you take the info, it might change. So just try to learn what you can with it. Try to see how you can apply it to the work that you've already been doing. And aside from that, let's jump into things. Let me set up my stream. As always, here's where we start. And the first thing we want to talk about, as basic as humanly possible, is the definition of light. I know, we're getting really complicated at the start here. But in the beginning, we need a definition just so that we know how this stuff is going to function. So, what is light? How I would describe it is it's the thing that allows us to see objects that are obscured in shadow through contrast. And the reason I have this lengthy definition, the reason that I want to describe things like this, is because I feel one issue that people have is that they see light as the thing itself that lets them see. What the heck does that mean? So, we'll start very basic, we'll flip it on its head, and then we'll go through other concepts to sort of illuminate what I mean by that. So, let's imagine that we have a very complex scene. So I spent a whole month on this. You're going to see a really detailed piece, but let's imagine that we have a piece with all the fancy elements. However, we have no light source. So there's no light at all. There's no reflected light. There's no like light coming back from the moon. There's nothing at all. Here is what that piece would look like. Not very impressive. And on the opposite side of things, again, talking about how does light help us not see? Let's assume that everything is as bright as our light source. So we have the brightest light source that we can imagine, and then we make all of our objects as bright as that light source. Here's what that looks like. As you can see, this does not help us see what's going on. You could say that it blinds you. So in the same way that too much darkness allows us to not see anything, too much light also does the same thing. Can't see anything. So we need a balance in order to understand what's going on in our scene. So as we can see, light itself does not help us see. It's the contrast that it generates that allows us to see information. And we have a nice little smaller example here. Some other reasons for why I like to define things like this. So we have our scene here. As we can see, we're in between that value range, not too bright, not too dark. And we're just going to put one object into this scene. Nice little circle. We have an issue, though. If we wanted to tell the viewer that this is a 3D scene, we're missing some information. And the most critical thing that you need in order to show that an object is 3D, or the subject is 3D, or it's in some sort of lived-in environment, is you need something called a core shadow, and that is just the shadow that tells you where things are going back into space. So, because it's a shadow, we're seeing that naturally things are dark, and the thing that generates that sense of depth to us is the shadow itself. Nice little flip. As we can see, shadow, sphere, very basic. Hopefully, we're not going to need anything too crazy yet. But now that we understand that we need to be able to see those shadows, we understand that it's dark, we're adding light. The thing that we need to get into now is contrast. And the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to contrast is exposure. So exposure is essentially how much light we're letting through. This is going back to what we were talking about earlier, where if we underexpose an image, and I think this is something that everyone is used to, I think this is how people work as a default, we'll see that anything that is in the light, anything that's in the view of that light source, that's the thing that's going to give us detail and information. And then the things that go back into shadow will read to us just as graphical shapes. So we're sort of just seeing that as like little graphic design elements. It's not where we're supposed to focus or look at. However, if we overexpose an image, we can actually do the same thing, but it's the other way around. So now, the light is acting as those graphical shapes, and then anything obscured in that shadow is where we're getting that level of detail. And pieces like this are kind of hard to understand if you don't have a sense that light is just generating contrast rather than generating visuals. And if you're like a beginner and you've made like your first like really sunny like anime beach scene, and you have like that super bright light, if you've ever struggled to be like, how do I get that balance down? Why isn't this working? One like beginner mistake that you might see or you might make yourself is just not understanding that like in an overexposed environment where we have like this high density of like these really extreme values, sometimes it's better to make it so that the light is the thing that's being obscured, and then the things that are hiding in shadows where you get that detail. So that's sort of like the beginning area. That's why we define things the way that we do. That's why I define things the way that I do. And that's sort of where I want to keep things in the direction of, is just changing how we define things to help us see information. Or view information differently, however you want to chop it up. And going into that, the next sort of way we're going to split up information is whether or not our lighting is diffuse or direct. So I like to put things in ranges. I think it's easier to assign things as one concept or the opposite concept, and then sort of gauge where our art sits within that. So if you've worked in 3D or if you're a photographer, please don't kill me. I know you guys like to split this up into like 4 different elements. I'm just choosing 2 to keep things simple. But essentially, we're just trying to gauge whether or not our lighting is diffuse or direct. And to quickly chop up what all that stuff means, it's just in diffuse, we have long transition times between values. Our value range is closer together. We'll get into values in a second, I promise. And we have a lot more like vague edges that get made up with either a light source or our shadowed areas. Generally low contrast, this isn't inherently true, but it's easier to condense this information and see things as low contrast. My default like go-to imagination for trying to understand diffuse imagery is just overcast lighting. Rainy day, no like crazy sun blaring at you, everything's just sort of like washed out in like a gray tone. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have direct light, so we have a larger value range. Things tend to be more saturated, but we get a lot more sharp shapes, quicker transition times between our light values and our shadow values. So just another way to chop up that stuff. And that is a lot of words, covered a lot of info. So we're just going to try and like summarize that within like a usable example. So this is a piece that I grabbed off of the feedback channel, and then I just sort of like changed a bit just so that we're not like directly ripping into anyone. We have like a piece here, an outline, and essentially the question that I saw was like, what are some things that I can do to push this in a direction? How do I assess my art when I have a reference, and how do I manipulate my reference? Give me 1 sec. Just checking the chat real quick. Oh, never mind. All right, so, how do I use the reference to break down info? How do I use it to sort of lead me in a direction? And I think the more questions you're able to ask your reference, the more answers you'll be able to get out of it. So, as we are talking about, since we're talking about light, we sort of want to convert things into black and white just so that there's less distractions going on. So we didn't really talk about values yet. So as you can see, we're just converting things to black and white. And we're looking at this piece and we're trying to answer these two questions. The first one is this direct lighting or is it diffuse light? And if we look, lots of slow transition times between our values. We can see that the light is slowly fading into this gray. There's no real like distinct like outline of any shapes. We're just sort of meandering in like this gray tone. And then the next question we can ask ourselves is this um, diffuse or direct? I'm sorry, did I already go over that? Like I said, gotta check my notes. One second. Overexposed or underexposed. So, now we're trying to find what range this setting essentially exists in. So, is this an overexposed image or an underexposed image? And how we're going to answer that is essentially where is the detail hiding in? Is the detail in our shadows or is the detail in our light? Well, overall, lots of shadows going on. We can see that the face is entirely in shadow, most of the details on the body are in shadows, and then our overall forms, 90% in shadow. And then, kind of hard to see in this reference, but in our outlines, in our like little edges here, we're seeing like very bright, almost invisible like transition times between that light value and that midtone value. So we can use that to essentially say, okay, this is a piece where it's underexposed. A lot of the detail we're getting is within that darkness, and we know, okay, whenever there's like a large shadow area, that's where our detail is going to go, and then if we want graphical shapes, that's where our light's going to go. And it's sort of just like one little method that we can use to sort of give us more direction and sort of understand how to apply the light that we're learning. And then I just have like a little touch up to be like, oh, now we can get it closer to the value range. And it's just that simple. Now we have like one more direction. We can build off the other information from there. So we zoom out. And then the next thing we want to cover is essentially what are the rules of light. So now we know that light's going to come in, it's going to light our piece, it's going to generate contrast, but not all that contrast is going to be even. It's very easy to understand that stuff where the light source is, so stuff close to the light source is going to be brighter, but if you've ever worked with any special materials, you know that this is not consistent. So we sort of need to understand like what is light actually allowed to do. And I broke this up into four major categories. Keep in mind, all of this stuff exists on a spectrum, so sometimes in order to understand one thing, you need to understand the other. So this is as simple as I can get it, and then we'll break it down into individual pieces of information. So, first thing is just absorb. So, an object will take that light in, or something will hold light in a specific area. Light can get reflected, so that means that light will hit something and essentially go backwards. Usually that's towards the light source. There's other exceptions, but that's just the easiest way to understand it. Light can scatter, so light can hit something or go through something, and then wherever that focus is, it will split up and go into a bunch of different directions. And then transmit is simply just when it goes through something. So light goes through an object, you can see it through the object, or in some wacky, bizarre scenario, it goes through an object, you can't see it in the object, but you'll see it exit the other side. I can't think of an example of that off the top of my head, but just know that is a way you can use the definition of transmit. So, now we're going to break those things up individually. So go into transmit. It's very simple to understand. Glass, bubbles, water. These are the most typical examples you'll see this. If you have a window in your house, very easy to understand. Light goes through the window, you see it. You shine a laser through a piece of glass, you see it. Very easy to understand. Next we have scattering. And we might have to jump ahead because I know we might have to talk about reflection just a little bit. It's the easiest way to understand this. But light comes down, hits something, and then is redirected back up. Easiest way to understand reflection is go look in a mirror. Very simple stuff. But one reason we're covering this individually is because we're going back into that information that we already covered. So we talked about direct light and diffuse light, and this is sort of where that definition comes back into play. So we can see that on a smooth surface, when the water is uninterrupted, that those rays of light come down, they bounce back up, and it's very even. So, as we can see on the left here, on that left side image, that read, those edges, that transition time, all the stuff we talked about, very quick, very fast. By contrast, we get a very clear read of that mirrored image. However, when the surface is uneven, when there's a lot of texture, there's a lot of movement, a lot of stuff going on, we still get a reflection, but now it's more diffuse. Now those transition times are longer, it's spreading out, and it's scattering our light. That's how we can see that in a reflection. The next is with transmission. So now we have light going through an object, and it's being cast down on something else. So when that light is going through that object, paper, very rough material, it's made out of wood, not very even. But when it goes through that, it's creating a lot of diffuse light. A lot of that light is being scattered around in different directions. And now we get into the thing that a lot of artists think are very fun, and I'm sure a lot of you have some sort of familiarity with this, and that is subsurface scattering. And essentially what is happening here is that that light is coming through, it's transmitting through an object, and then it is scattering as it hits all those bits of information that are inside that object. So as you know, you're a person, you have flesh, you have bones, you have a whole bunch of complicated stuff going on. As far as light is concerned, those are all objects. So it'll have your skin, the cells in your skin, your blood cells, all that stuff, and it just starts scattering light all over the place. And typically, the thicker the object, the less light can scatter through it. And that's sort of what you're seeing when light passes through you. It makes that really cool orange tone. We're getting a partial transmission where some of that light gets captured and scattered around, and then the rest of it just it kicks it to the curb. It goes through the other side, or it scatters in a different direction. That's the easiest way to understand it. A more niche thing to understand is just like plants. Those are the most like common areas you'll really see some of this stuff happen. So plants are very thin. They're very nature-esque. They like to absorb light. So that light will come into the plant, get partially absorbed. You'll get this really cool effect, and then the rest of it will kick it to the curb. Very simple stuff. I know I'm using a lot of words. Like I said, we're gonna go back, break some of this stuff down, ask some simpler questions, but just going through each one at a time. The next thing is absorb. So again, don't try to memorize this, as we're gonna flash some graphs and get a little scientific. Maybe just try and understand it, see how you can apply it to your own work. But we are gonna whip out some graphs here, some crazy lines. But essentially, how we can understand absorption is just how much light is being held by an object. So light comes in, it hits that object absorbs it, and then some of it gets reflected back. And that's how we sort of read things as specific colors. I think this little lens example over here is the easiest way to understand it, because typically as humans, we sort of think of it the opposite way, where all of the light is getting reflected, and then the thing that's being held by the object is the color that's getting into the thing and then getting stuck. In reality, it's the other way around. They said super niche information, but it's just general way to understand that like light is getting split up and broken up. That's like the main takeaway from this. And of course, just like from these little spheres, just like a visual example, where the lighter an object is, the more light and the more values are sort of getting kicked out of that object, and the darker it is, the more it's holding on to those values. And moving forward, there's a question you might have asked yourself as an artist, which is why is red and blue like the things that we're attracted to the most? And how does this play into absorption and sort of how we can play with the values that we're choosing? All of this is just due to the light spectrum. There are other pieces of information we're going to get into to help us understand that. But essentially, the largest spectrum that we can see once we get into visible light is red. And it's the thing that we generally pick up on first. Again, we'll get into like light splitting later. Don't worry about that stuff. But largest range, main takeaway. And then as we move through the visible light spectrum, the most intense light that we'll usually get hit with is blue before things start going purple, and then it gets into ultraviolet, and then things get all messy and weird. So the thing that we always see first is red, and then the highest level of that visible light spectrum that's intense to us is blue. So if you're ever wondering like why is red and blue like the most popular colors ever, it's typically why. It's just how our eyes respond to those colors. And then moving forward, yeah. And now that we understand that, we're going back to values. Again, we're starting in grayscale. We're just sort of thinking about light comes in, it hits a value. So none of this is like a hard science, but if we wanted to actually like apply absorption, like why I even bothered showing you all these graphs in the first place, it just comes down to helping us choose colors for our values. A lot of artists start in grayscale, and the one thing that we want to do is sort of have some sort of guide whenever we get stuck. So let's say like we started adding colors, or we haven't started adding colors, we're still in that grayscale mode, and we sort of want to think about how do I choose colors? What's some sort of like cheat sheet I can use? Well, generally, high intensity colors, like we talked about, those darker values that are absorbing more light are going to be within that blue and red range, and then those lighter values are going to be outside of that. So typically like greens and like lime greens, generally in that spectrum. And keep in mind that this is on a spectrum, and there are other niches. So like light blue exists, and that'll probably be within that lighter value range. But this is just like a quick little cheat sheet in order to help you break that information down. And then the next thing we have is reflection, and we're gonna retread some old ground here. As you can see, we have a old slide here. But essentially, this is just what we talked about earlier. Light gets reflected, comes down, hits an object, bounces out. And again, within that range, direct and diffuse. So the smoother the material, clearer the image, the more textured and rough it is, the more it'll like scatter around and do crazy stuff. But we already covered this. We already know about mirrors. We talked about water. That's the second time you saw that reflection. But there's one thing that people struggle with, and this is something that I really wanted to get into because I feel like this is like the first like unique material that I think people don't really implicitly understand, and it's sort of where they get mixed up, especially in those beginner phases. And that is metal. And understanding how reflection works with metal, because I feel like what people start off with is something like this. They do like their material study. They grab that like one image off of ArtStation where it's just like a little metal sphere, and they're like, I don't understand why this doesn't look like metal. I have the high contrast. I have those like dark areas that I'm seeing in the reference, but it doesn't look like metal. And the reason that this happens is because in order for humans, us, to see things as metal, we need that element of reflection. And one way I like to sort of truncate that or like have a little shorthand to memorize that is that metal likes to tell stories. So metal likes to tell us what's going on within that environment. So as you can see in these examples, like in the helmet, we're getting this nice little tree range. The beam, classic example. Within that shadowed area, we're getting that cityscape reflecting back to us. And then, nice lady with a sword, we can see a bit of her face in that little shadowed area. And I think one thing that we can already pick up on is just this will usually sit within that shadow range. So wherever that shadow area starts, that's where we'll see a lot of that reflection start to happen. And then depending on how smooth that material is, or how rough and textured it is, that reflected image will be either diffuse or very direct. You can sort of see this. You know, we have like this old helmet. It's sort of shiny. It's got most of what it needs going on, but the image here is a bit more vague, so that reflection is a bit more diffuse. Whereas the bean, very shiny, very polished, and we're getting a lot more of a clearer read. And if you wanted to sort of reapply this to a more neutral environment, we sort of have to go back to that level of fundamental. So this is sort of like a stock image. This might be like something that you're used to seeing. You might not be drawing rebar. I don't know why you would, but hey, you're you. But like I'm sure you've seen like stock image metal, and you're like, okay, I want to do my study, and then you get something like this. But if you wanted to break this down and sort of understand like how could I improve this? How could I sort of mess with this a bit more? Um, that's the cheat sheet that's essentially happening. So in this shadow area, we're getting this light that's being reflected. Consider that bounce light. So that light is bouncing back, reflecting that light back onto that material. And now that we went over those notes and we have this level of understanding, we can sort of understand why this doesn't look quite like metal. And it's because it's not reflecting any of the imagery that's around it. And the environment is 100% white. And as we already went over, 100% white makes things hard to see. Um, so one way we could improve this is we could change the color environment. Maybe with the background of this little floor texture here is red. We could have some red bouncing into that image. Or if you're really crazy and you really want to detail things, we could have a bit of the previous material reflected within that shadow zone. So we could actually redraw parts of that rebar inside this little shadow area instead of just having like this vague white light that's getting bounced around. Highly recommend, don't start practicing this with rebar. There's lots of small textures in here. I think this is crazy. But it's just sort of something that you can think about if you need help improving that like metal texture environment. And that's part of the reason why I want to go over stuff like this is if you can sort of understand what light is and isn't allowed to do, it makes like these more niche materials a lot easier to digest and study. And then now I've sort of been lying to you guys, okay? I've been playing a little trick on you. This isn't all there is to metal, and that's sort of why I isolated this. There's a lot more going on with metal, and there's just one or two more concepts that we really need to get into. And then you can wrap up, take a break, and chill out. So, what is the next thing that's going on? What have I been lying to you about? So the astute among you if we zoom in here, you might notice something. Metal is reflective. We talked about that. It's very simple. But especially in this like generated version of this, something that you might see in like a 3D environment, um, we're getting some weird stuff happening. Very reflective in the center. But as we get towards the outside here, things are getting like diffuse and they're like turning white for some reason. And you can sort of see that even in like a really shiny object. Very clear reflection in the center here. We can see the little guy who took a picture. But things are like getting diffuse and they're like getting all messed up around the outside. And we sort of want to understand like, what is this? Like, why is this happening? And that goes back to a concept called the Fresnel Effect. And that is a very fancy word to essentially say that as we get closer to something, and this is why we covered that previous information, broke it down the way we did, as we get closer to something, that object will generally become more transmissive, so we're seeing through that object more. And as we get further away towards the edges, it'll be more reflective instead. So that's when more of that light will reflect back, and then if we're lacking information, it'll just go to whatever that source light color is. Again, a lot of words. Is there an easier way to understand this? Like, yes, water. Go outside right now, look at a river. The water closest to you, you'll see through the bottom, you'll see the rocks. And then as we get further out, we'll see more of that reflection. If we want to tread some old ground here, we can see in this image a lot of that mountain range that's getting reflected towards us, it's diffuse. Why is it diffuse? Well, we can see that the water is very ripply, it's uneven, and it's moving around. So now we understand why that's happening. Another like real world example of this, because water is very boring, or at least what we're used to. Table. Go look at a clear surface right now with something on it. If you're looking directly down on it, you'll notice that that shadow is a lot harder to see. Those edges will kind of clean up, especially within whatever you can see of the shadow, if anything at all. But then as we make more of an angle and it's sort of facing us, we're increasing that range of that angle. That reflection, the reflectiveness of that shadow, actually increases. And now we're seeing some detail on like the can even a little bit. Even on this like low quality image, we're still sort of getting some of that info. So now we take another look and we're just sort of reanalyzing what's happening here. Towards the outside, we're seeing that Fresnel effect. We're seeing that light increase as it's more reflective in the center. And same dealio is happening over here. This one is just like an extreme of both of those little effects. Depending on the material, depending on how diffuse that material is, we'll either see more in the center or less, and then those edges will be a bit more dramatic with like how much light is shining off the edges or not. Another reason to sort of understand and break things up into categories is to sort of see how it will affect our material. And with that in mind, there's one super sneaky, dark, evil magic that we have to cover, and then we can pretty much be wrapped up. And that is refraction. So, what is refraction? Well, we know the major rules of what light can do. So refraction is a form of transmission. So light goes through something, and one thing you might not consider, one thing you might not really think about, is that the speed of light can actually change. So when we get into refraction, again, this is just a form of transmission, that speed will actually slow down, and when light slows down, the angle will change. So in my like little simple kindergartner example, we can see that that light is actually slowing down and dropping down within that little pane of glass, and then it returns back to its normal speed. Light doesn't like to be told what to do, so it generally will return to whatever it was doing. And depending on the angle of this, we can get some pretty crazy effects. This is like the most standard bare bones example that you'll see. But then we get other stuff like this. This is called total internal reflection or total internal refraction, because when things refract, when they go through something, when they're transmitted through something, easier to see. But essentially what is happening is that that light is transmitting through. It's going all the way through, and then it's getting caught on an edge, and then reflecting back with inside that object that it's being transmitted through. That's just reflecting inside something. Very simple. Try to keep things simple. But at normal angles, this is just typically what that'll look like. Very niche thing, not really what you use too much. But one thing that'll happen is that at very specific angles, crazy stuff starts to happen. What is actually happening here? Because now we're getting white light, and now it's turning into like all these colors. Well, now we want to think about the things that we talked about earlier as I introduce this new information. So, as we know, as light goes through something, as light goes through a value range, it gets absorbed, and then some of that light gets kicked out. Well, what if that light is all getting kicked out, but at different angles? And that's sort of what happens when we're shooting light into objects at specific angles. Light goes in, the speed of that light changes, and then when it has to reflect out, because it's operating at different speeds, it gets split up. Uh, Lots of like crazy lore here going on, but don't worry, we're gonna simplify things in a second. But essentially, at certain angles, light gets transmitted through things, and sometimes it breaks up and gives us this nice little prism effect. And when we put this on a spectrum, again, these are crazy graphs, so don't have to worry about this, but just the takeaway from this is that as visible light goes through something, if the angle changes, it gets split up. And that's sort of why we covered diffuse light in the beginning. Um, when light is getting captured, when some of it's getting absorbed, when light's hitting an uneven surface, we have an understanding that light travels in different directions. And this is what happens when it gets slowed down and is forced to move in different directions along an axis. So it's just like a direct minor plane. So you can see that like as we go through a direct path, things get split up and they're uniformly split into a nice little rainbow. So going back to like artistic concepts, going back to like how we think about these things, it's essentially just like, okay, why do we consider red a fast color? Well, simply, it's the first thing that comes out whenever you split up light. So we go back to our other example here. If we're looking at the angle that this is getting reflected at, the value that's on top is that red light. If you look at a rainbow, generally that first value that comes through a rainbow is that red light. And then things get split up along that spectrum as we understand it. So that's typically why we think about red as like fast and like blue is like slow and like depressing. It's sort of where some of that psychology comes back to. And simpler terms, stuff that you probably more realistically use, cup. If you're ever wondering why this little effect happens, that's just refraction. Light is hitting that object. We have a transparent object, so we're going to be able to see what's in that water. And then because that light is being refracted, because of that speed is changing, we're seeing like this weird angle that's happening. And then last little piece of information is just some nerd stuff. Let's say you're like galaxy brain level artist and you're like, I really want to get into like showing that I have an understanding of this. Again, you don't need to memorize this, but different materials have different speeds that they travel at. So like with this graph, all this is saying is that like depending on what transparent material it is, that angle that things change at will be more crazy. So like if you want to have like diamond sitting in water and you really want to show people you understand light, just have like the light that's being refracted in that diamond be like more dramatic and have it at a larger angle. I don't think you'd ever use that, but now you know. But that is the bulk of what we have been talking about. And then last little piece of information, last little shindig we're gonna get into here is just how do we use this? Because that was a lot of info. I'm probably gonna remember like 10% of it. Like I said, I had to take notes to even get like a percentage of what I'm telling you down. So how do we use this? How do we simplify it? We just simplify it into three major questions, and that's what is the object? What color is the object essentially? That'll tell us like how much light that's taking in. If we're working in grayscale, we can look at the value ranges that we're working with. Is that object special? So is this like a reflective material? Is it some sort of water? Is it some sort of metal? Uh, if we want to distinguish like skin from metal or skin from cloth, what are the rules that happen? Well, now we know that skin is going to be something that can partially transmit. It'll have subsurface scattering in certain light environments. And we know that matte material is very diffuse because matte material is generally textured. We can think about texture as just softer shadows if we really wanted to simplify things. And then when we get into texture, is that texture smooth or soft? Are we going to have quicker transition times between light and dark, or are things going to slow down? And that's sort of how we break up that information into just three simple questions. And essentially, the point of all of this, the reason why I sort of overloaded you with like a bunch of info is just now we have all the tools we need. We have a deep level understanding to go back and condense it down into basic information. And when we look at our drawing, when we're drawing from reference, and we're trying to understand like how did they make the metal look like this? How did they make the skin look like this? Now it's just a matter of like, okay, what are my major rules? Is it doing this thing in this direction or this thing in the opposite direction? And hopefully that gives you something to ponder about, something to break up the material, and think a little differently about light and how you use it. And I hope that was helpful. And like I said, I did a lot of yapping very quickly. So we have plenty of time for questions if we want to like deeply dive into something else. Uh, if we got nothing, I have like one other thing. On tab, he's still here. Tabby, are you here? So I'll dismiss that, and then if they want to re-ask a question, go for it. But yeah, take time for that. I'll give it like a minute or two if someone's like typing something out. They have like another follow-up question or something I want to go into a bit deeper. Um, yeah, after that, I'll answer whatever questions we have. I'll go over like one more thing, and then we'll wrap things up. What are good exercises to practice? I think for this, I'm gonna actually say don't do material studies per se. I think a lot of that comes down to what you're trying to do as an artist, but generally how I would use information like this is applying it to references. So if I have some sort of reference, let me just like grab one off of ArtStation really quick. Yeah, 1 second. And that is too generic. Let's do something like this. I like to practice references, especially of artists that I like or art that I'm trying to like simulate or go in a specific direction with. So I'm sort of using this to answer questions rather than make like specific study sets. So if I'm looking at a piece like this, I'm asking myself those questions over again. So, what value range are we working in? Is this image underexposed or overexposed? Are we getting detail in the light or are we getting detail in the dark? And that's like why it's useful to just like convert things into grayscale, sort of see what's going on. And then within those materials, um, what materials are we using? What is this jacket made out of? And sort of answering that with what we understand about light. So I can see that it's sort of reflective, it's very glossy. We're getting a lot of light that has quick transition times between the darks and the lights. I'm thinking about the average temperature. I'm thinking about how much light this character is absorbing. I can see that if I zoom out here, that skin tone is very pink. And I can see that that hair is very shiny and reflective. Again, in that direct zone, a lot of light is bouncing back towards us, the viewer. And I'm just using that to sort of break that down and categorize this information. And I think it's a lot easier to understand things with that, especially if you're using a reference and you're drawing. And that's sort of why we had this little example from earlier. Where are we? This guy. Just seeing like, hey, I'm drawing from reference. Where should I be putting detail? Should I be putting it in the shadow or in the light? I'm drawing from reference. Is my image overexposed or underexposed? And using that to sort of organize how we're applying light and where things need to be pushed up or brought back down. I think it's a lot more practical than just like vague light environment studies. I'm not saying don't do them. I just think it's harder to do stuff like that because the person who's making all of those decisions is you rather than having some information that's there that you sort of have to like pick apart and digest in a way that makes sense to you. Yeah, unless someone has any other questions, just this one other thing I'm gonna cover real quick, and then we can wrap up. And that is that light. How do we phrase this? Light doesn't like to be interrupted or told what to do. So once there is a pattern established, generally light will keep that pattern. And again, what does it actually mean? I took a nice little picture from my house here in my nice little handy dandy kitchen. Don't worry about the image quality, that's not what's important. But essentially I have this little map laid out that we have this primary light source over here on the right side of the room. It's hitting these cabinets and then it's casting this nice big shadow over here on these images. And light source number 2 here, this little ceiling fan, is off. And I'll get into why we're talking about this in a second. But essentially, I have some nice diffuse light, but there's some weird stuff that's happening. From that main light source, our images here are diffuse. Within that shadow, we can see those shadows are very diffuse. But then, for some reason, these little panes are direct. Getting a lot of other things that are direct here. How is that happening? Well, essentially, uh, light's not going to get interrupted. If light can keep going, it's going to keep going. And because we're in a scene, because we're in a controlled environment, when light hits something, it reflects back and goes towards wherever that is. So these large, further away objects, it's going to follow the rules of that first light source. So the light from there, those objects that are getting hit first, are more diffuse. But then when that light comes back, those smaller objects that are closer to environment, that have those tighter areas of occlusion, they're going to get locked in because our light's not really interested in interrupting them. What will happen instead is that they'll generally get lighter, so the shadows will get more vague rather than their shape being changed by the light and like this light area carving in to this cast shadow. Just sort of to understand what's going on, in the blue little scribbles, we have our nice diffuse light and then outline where things are direct. So if we turn on that second light source, and just ask yourself this real quickly, what do you think will happen now that we have light that is going to, instead of bouncing back, it's going to directly hit at a different angle all of these pretty little images and their shadows? What will happen is that all the same information will stay. Like I said, shadows, the light environment that we have, the dominant light source, doesn't like to be interrupted. So we still have all these shadows here. All of the shapes are maintained, but we can see that they're a lot lighter because now we've introduced a light source hitting it from behind. So now we can see that we still have all the same information. Our diffuse edges are a lot more diffuse, a lot harder to see. But in our direct shadows that we had from earlier, they're still there. They're still very hard lined, very direct, but they did not disappear. And now we just have the addition of other shadows from that light going the opposite direction. So now we have the same information happening, just in the opposite direction. So another thing to consider is like, hey, light doesn't stop, especially in a controlled environment. And then just sort of understanding like what's our dominant light source and what's like a secondary one that'll play like a backup role. And that's sort of like intro to 3-point lighting, but we're obviously not going to get into that. And that sort of concludes everything we had to talk about today. I hope this gives you something else to consider when approaching light. Hopefully this gives you stuff to break down when you're manipulating light, when you're adding it to your environment. Ultimately, I hope you guys have a great day. Give some time to just type what you need in chat, and we'll wrap it up here. Good lesson. Thank you for your time. Thank you for showing up. Always appreciate it. So that person one chance. Gave me a new perspective. Excellent. Yeah, that's really the main takeaway. It wasn't really to blast your brain, just like give you some different ways to think about what's going on. But yeah, next session will probably be within another couple of weeks. Topic hasn't been decided yet. If you have suggestions, let me know. And of course, I'll open up that group study channel again, so you can see some of the references that I use. A lot of them go way more in depth than what we talked about today. But yeah, if you want to explore, if you want to dive deeper, I'm not going to stop you. I'll open up that channel back up and you can see everything that I use. But other than that, I'll catch you guys on the flip side. Peace out. Bye-bye.